Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and discusses 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. On each week of Lent, 5 Books for Catholics recommends a work for the season. Moreover, it aims to recommend different kinds of work. Not just writings that expound Christian doctrine directly, but also works of literature, music, and art that help us contemplate the Lenten mysteries and enter into them. This week's recommended work is a collection of sacred music by Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina. Last year, a selection of 20th century classical music for Lent was surveyed. This year, it is worth harking back to the 16th century and late Renaissance music to commemorate the 5th centenary of Palestrina's birth. Giovanni Pierluigi hailed from Palestrina. In 1537, he became a choir boy of the Roman Basilica of St. Mary Major, where he would have been exposed to the polyphony of Franco-Flemish composers, then dominant in Rome. In 1544, he was appointed organist and singer at the Cathedral of Palestrina. There, he may have caught the attention of the Bishop Cardinal Giovanni Maria Ciocchi del Monte, the future Julius III. The year after the election of Julius III, Palestrina moved definitively to Rome. He served first as maestro of the Cappella Giulia, the choir for the solemn services of the chapter of St. Peter's Basilica, from 1551 to 1554, and 20 years later he took up the position anew until the end of his life. He also served for a while as a singer in the papal choir, the Sistine Chapel Choir. However, he had to step down from that post in 1555. Paul IV had issued a motu proprio that excluded married men from the choir. At any rate, Palestrina was not without work. He succeeded Orlando Lassus as maestro at St. John Lateran, before passing to the same role at St. Mary Major, and then the Roman Seminary. His occupancy of these prestigious posts means that he was held in high regard by the ecclesiastics in Rome, as does his place of burial, St. Peter's Basilica. Unfortunately, subsequent remodeling in the basilica covered his tomb, whose exact location is no longer known. During his busy career as a church musician, Palestrina nonetheless composed an impressive body of sacred music that comprises 104 settings of the Common of the Mass and more than 250 motets. As a composer, he was more a conservative than an innovator. He worked within the traditions and conventions of an existing style that had already been brought to new heights by Josquin des Prez and Cristobal de Morales. Nevertheless, Palestrina further refined his tradition and style. He surpassed his predecessors in shaping the music more closely to the text and layering the various voices seamlessly over one another. In that sense, he is an innovative composer. He was also steeped in the older tradition of Gregorian chant. Not only did he teach it, but began work on a revision of the gradual. Palestrina's fame was cemented from the 18th century on. For various reasons, particularly in German-speaking countries, he came to be considered the supreme representative of Renaissance sacred music. For Catholics, there was a strong reason to privilege Palestrina, his supposed role in swaying the Council of Trent against the proposed ban of polyphonic compositions in the liturgy. The story goes that a sizable contingent was pushing for this ban. It favored the sobriety of Gregorian chant over the latest polyphonic works. In Gregorian chant, the text was enunciated clearly and not lost in elaborate, florid strands of counterpoint. Palestrina's Missa Pape Marcelli, the story continues, persuaded the Council Fathers not to ban polyphonic compositions in the liturgy. It showed how the liturgical text could come across clearly even in a polyphonic setting. The composer Agostino Agazzari appears to be one source for this story. The story was even brought to the stage in Hans Pfitzner's opera Palestrina. However, it is just a legend. There is nonetheless a grain of truth to it. The story concludes correctly that Palestrina's approach to polyphony was simpler and more sober than that of other composers of the period. Johann Joseph Fuchs picked up on this and other features of Palestrina's style in his influential textbook on composition, the Gradus ad Parnassum of 1725. The second part of the book is on counterpoint and takes Palestrina as the main model and master. Fuchs noted that, compared to other Renaissance polyphonists, Palestrina reduced the number, size, and impetus of leaps, favoring smoother melodic lines instead. He also called attention to Palestrina's comparatively tempered use of dissonance. Generally, Palestrina confines dissonance to passing notes, weak beats, and suspensions. In the last case, he tends to resolve the dissonance immediately. Fuchs' analysis was largely corroborated during the 20th century in the studies of Knud Jeppesen. Fuchs's influential textbook raised Palestrina's profile in German-speaking lands. However, Fuchs was not the Italian composer's only proponent. Various other cultural movements shaped the reading and reception of Palestrina in 18th and 19th century German culture. James Garrett has analyzed them in his Palestrina and the German Romantic Imagination. One of the movements Garrett discusses is the Catholic Cecilian movement. It was committed to the reform of sacred music and had a predilection for Palestrina. It cropped up in last year's post on Bruckner's sacred music. The 19th century German reception of Palestrina may have idealized him excessively and exaggerated his originality. Not only has scholarship in Palestrina matured since then, more importantly, the musicology of the period has expanded. A greater range of Renaissance composers has been studied. Current assessment of Palestrina's place within Renaissance sacred music, therefore, are more nuanced. Of the many excellent recordings of works by Palestrina, hardly any are dedicated to his Lenten motets. However, Volume 6 of the 16th Palestrina series includes, alongside three of the composer's motets on the Song of Song and his L'Homme Armé Mass, a selection of 7 motets and offertories that are penitential in character. On track 1, there is Parce Mihi Domine, a setting of Job chapter 7, verses 16 to 21. On track 2, there is Peccantum me quotidie, a setting of the 7th responsory of the Matins of the office of the deceased. The offertory Siambulavro in medio tribulationis is a setting of Psalm 138, verse 7. Tribulationis civitatum audivimus is a response loosely based on Judith chapter 4 and chapter 7 of the Vetus Latina text. The offertory Super Flumina Babylonis by the rivers of Babylon is taken from Psalm 137, verse 1. The offertory De Profundis Clamavi, out of the depths I cry to you, Lord, is a setting of the opening verse of the last of the 7 penitential psalms, Psalm 130. It's on track 9. And then on track 16 is Tribularer sine scirem, a response based on Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, and verse 15, chapter 15, verse 22, and Luke chapter 5, verse 32. All but the last of these 7 compositions are for 5 voices. When composing for 5 voices, Palestrina normally assigns 2 to the tenors. In Super Flumina Babylonis, by the rivers of Babylon, he opts for 2 contraltos instead. This is one indication of how he selects the ensemble best suited to the text. Moreover, the melody of this offertory is in the major. Doleful, it is tinged with hope. Instead of piling on the melodrama, Palestrina captures the deeper sentiments expressed in this prayer. Often he stresses the most significant phrases, for example the first four bars of Tribulationis civitatum audivimus, linger with long notes in the first word, Tribulationis, troubles. There are numerous repetitions of me who sin and do not repent at the opening of Peccantum me quotidie. In Tribularer, there are two series of 9 repetitions of the Cantus Firmus, Have mercy on me, God. In that series, each successive repetition rises a note, reaches the 5th, and then descends a note. De Profundis Clamavi is another good example of how the composer responds to the text. To convey the prayer's ascent to God from the depths, the opening rises from the tenors through the contralto to the soprano, whereas the melody falls a 5th before leaping up an octave. At other times, as in the middle section of Peccantum me quotidie, Palestrina uses bold harmonies and modulations to capture the emotional intensity of the text. In these works, as in the rest of his sacred music, Palestrina puts his art and craftsmanship at the service of liturgical prayer. His works are meant to lead us into prayer and the contrite entreaty of God's mercy. At the same time, they express the beauty of God's loving mercy. Thank you for listening. To gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.